I still remember the night Gary looked me straight in the eye and told me I was nothing but a pathetic little mouse, that he was embarrassed to be seen with me at his boss's wedding, a man who owned half the construction business in Boston. He said I should stay home so I wouldn't humiliate him in front of the city's elite, and the way he spat those words like they were poison, it carved something into me I'll never forget. He had no clue that moment. That cruel little outburst was the beginning of the end for him, and, though I didn't know it yet, the first spark of my own rebirth. I walked into the hallway after he stormed off, and I caught sight of myself in the mirror by the front door. The light overhead was weak, yellowish, flickering like it was tired of burning, and for a second I thought I was staring at a stranger. 15 years earlier, that mirror had held a girl with long blonde hair, eyes so full of mischief, laughing at her own reflection as she rushed out to meet friends. Now I saw sagging shoulders, skin that carried lines deeper than my age, shadows under my eyes that no concealer could hide. It felt like the girl I used to be had been washed away, drip by drip, in the endless cycle of laundry loads and late-night dinners. My life had shrunk to kids' schedules and chores, Ethan's soccer practice, Hannah's piano lessons, the science fair project we stayed up making out of cardboard and glitter that ended up on the kitchen floor for days, grocery lists, Target runs, folding Gary's shirts at midnight while he snored in the other room, and in all of that, somewhere along the way, I forgot myself. My neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, once joked that she saw me more often in my driveway carrying trash bags than dressed up for anything. I laughed with her, but when the door closed behind me, I stood in the laundry room and cried into a pile of towels because she was right. Gary never asked why I looked so drained, why my hands were always chapped from scrubbing, why I never had new clothes when he bought himself another tailored suit. He didn't see me, or maybe he chose not to. To him, I was just background noise, part of the furniture that kept the household running while he climbed higher at work. I used to tell myself I was doing it for love, that this was what marriage meant. But standing there in that dim hallway, staring at a face that hardly felt like mine, I felt the sting of his words burrow deeper, and for the first time in years, something inside me whispered, maybe this isn't all I'm meant to be. Gary always acted like his job was some sacred sacrifice, like just showing up and collecting his paycheck was proof he was carrying the whole world on his shoulders. He never missed a chance to remind me how much he worked, but when it came to what I did every single day, the cooking, the cleaning, the homework, the endless piles of laundry, it didn't even register for him. He would look me up and down with that same sour face and say things like, "God, Megan, you've let yourself go." I can still hear the disgust in his voice. He'd sneer and call me a plain little mouse, a pathetic sight he was ashamed to claim as his wife, and I would just stand there, frozen, my insides twisted up so tight it was hard to breathe. What was I supposed to say back? That I barely had 5 hours of sleep most nights because I was ironing his shirts until midnight and setting my alarm for 6 so I could make breakfast before he left. That the last time I bought something for myself that wasn't groceries was years ago, a pair of clearance sneakers at Walmart. I knew he wouldn't hear it. In his mind, he brought home the paycheck, and that gave him the right to dismiss everything else as women's stuff, background noise, nothing worth acknowledging. And then came the wedding. His boss, Thomas, who also happened to be his best friend, was marrying some young woman from a wealthy family, and the whole thing was going to be extravagant, the kind of event that gets covered in the Boston Society pages. A private country club outside the city, chandeliers, champagne, all the movers and shakers. The thought of it made Gary unravel. He was pacing through our living room like a storm trapped in a cage, ranting about the level of sophistication, how every guest would look like they'd stepped straight out of Vogue. He turned on me suddenly, his face red, his arms waving like he was swatting invisible flies. "Do you even understand who's going to be there? Every woman in designer gowns, dripping in diamonds, and then you." The way he spat that word, you, it was like I was dirt under his shoe. He said I'd humiliate him just by standing at his side. I remember Hannah was in the next room, coloring at the kitchen table, and Ethan was stretched out on the floor, building something with Legos. I prayed they couldn't hear him. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my ears, and all I could think was how trapped I was, cornered in my own home by the very man who vowed to love me. His panic poured out as cruelty, buckets of icy contempt splashing right over me, and all I could do was swallow it down, again, while something inside me whispered that this couldn't be the rest of my life. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'd be ashamed to walk in there with you. You'd humiliate me in front of everyone." My throat tightened so fast it felt like I couldn't swallow. I didn't want diamonds. I didn't want a red carpet entrance. I just wanted him to see me, to treat me with a little warmth and respect. But in Gary's world, apparently, that was asking too much. Then he delivered the final blow. "You're not going. I'll tell them you're sick. Just stay home and save us both the embarrassment." He tossed those words at me like scraps thrown to a dog and disappeared into his office, slamming the door. The sound echoed through the house, and I swear I could feel the walls shaking with it. I stood in the middle of our living room, dizzy with humiliation. It wasn't just that he thought I was unattractive. It was worse than that. I was something to be hidden, a shameful secret, like a stain on his perfect image. My knees gave way, and I sank into the couch, shaking with silent sobs. Not because he had hurt me, I was used to that by then, but because I suddenly pitied myself. I pitied that younger version of me, the girl with big eyes and laughter in her voice, the one who dreamed about art school and long summer road trips. Somewhere along the way, I had abandoned her. I had let her die inside me, and sitting there, I realized just how cruel that betrayal was. The next week in our house felt like a war zone. Every time I tried to reason with him, it ended in shouting. I told him I deserved to be at that wedding, that I was his wife, not some shameful secret to hide away. I begged him to see how demeaning it was, how much it hurt. He never flinched. Every argument ended the same way, with him standing over me, his voice sharp and final. "You're not going." End of story. At night, after the kids were asleep, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it whir while Gary snored beside me. And in the dark, I kept asking myself, how many more times can I endure this? How many more humiliations before something in me breaks for good? I thought about my daughter, Hannah, carefully brushing her doll's hair before bed, and I asked myself, what am I teaching her if I keep living like this? That women are supposed to accept being trampled? That our worth depends on whether a man deems us beautiful enough to be seen in public? That question kept burning inside me, and it was the first flicker of fight I had felt in years. "You're not going. End of story." That's how Gary kept shutting me down every single night, his voice flat and final, like a judge who already decided the verdict. And for a while, I almost gave in, almost convinced myself it was easier to stay quiet and keep the peace. Until one evening, as I was tucking Hannah into bed, I watched her gently fix the little dress on her favorite doll, smoothing the fabric with such care, whispering to it like it mattered. And in that quiet moment, something broke inside me because I realized that by accepting his contempt, I was teaching my daughter that a woman's place was to bow her head, that she should accept being invisible, and I couldn't bear the thought of passing that lesson down to her. The next morning, I woke with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years, not the trembling panic I usually carried around, but a cold, steady determination that filled me with more strength than anger ever had. And when I walked into the kitchen and saw Gary sipping his coffee, scrolling on his phone as though the night before had never happened, I stood there and told him in a voice that didn't shake that I was going to that wedding whether he liked it or not, and if he refused to take me with him, I'd call a cab myself and show up, and I would tell Thomas, his boss, and everyone else exactly how he treated me at home, every cruel word, every humiliation he had ever thrown my way. For a heartbeat, he just stared at me, stunned, like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him, and then I saw his jaw tighten and the red crawl up his neck as he realized I wasn't bluffing, that I was ready to blow up his polished image, if that's what it took. And the idea of me making a scene at an event filled with Boston's wealthiest was something he couldn't afford. So he leaned toward me and hissed through his teeth that fine, I had won, but only under his conditions, that I would not arrive with him. I would take a cab, and I would come in late, long after the champagne was flowing and the crowd was distracted, and I would sit quietly at the farthest table where no one would even notice me. My stomach knotted as he laid out his little terms, each one meant to cut me down and remind me of my place. Yet even as I nodded, I felt a flicker of victory, because no matter how hard he tried to shrink me, I knew I would be there. And lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the fan above me, I kept replaying his words and realized that while he thought he had forced me into a corner, something inside me had shifted for good, because all I could see was Hannah's tiny hands adjusting that doll's dress and her sweet voice whispering that it looked perfect. And I swore then and there that my daughter would never grow up, believing a man had the right to decide if she was worth being seen. Gary laid down his final order like he was dictating terms to a prisoner, saying I would slip in quietly, take the farthest seat, make sure nobody even noticed I was there, and hearing it broke something inside me, because it wasn't enough that I had to come alone. He needed to erase me completely, to turn me invisible at an event where every other wife would sparkle in sequins and laughter. My throat closed around the lump that rose there, and though I managed to nod, agreeing like it was some sort of truce, I knew it was only a half victory, but still, it was enough to keep me breathing, because at least I would be there, no matter how small he wanted me to feel. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I collapsed into the armchair by the window, my body suddenly so heavy it felt like I had been carrying 100 pounds of silence for years and had just dropped it on my own chest. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, almost without thinking, dialing Nicole, my best friend since high school, the one who worked in one of the top salons downtown. When she answered, all I managed was, "Hey, it's me," before my voice cracked and the tears I'd been holding back spilled out. She didn't need details to know. She'd heard this tone before. Nicole's voice went from soft concern to sharp steel in a heartbeat, and I could almost see her eyes narrowing the way they did whenever she was about to go to battle for someone she loved. She let me sob my way through the story, the wedding, Gary's cruel words about me being an embarrassment, the humiliating rules he had slapped on me, and she didn't interrupt once, just let me get it all out. When I finally fell silent, blotting my face with the sleeve of my sweatshirt, there was this pause, and then her voice cut through, low and certain. "Stay put. Don't move. We're coming over." I blinked through my tears, confused. "We?" I whispered, but she was already one step ahead, saying, "Brooke's with me. We'll be there soon." And just like that, the loneliness that had been crushing me eased a little, because I knew what it meant when the two of them showed up together. It meant reinforcements. It meant I wasn't going to face this alone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny flicker of hope stirring in my chest. Brooke had always been the bold one, the girl who never backed down, the one who could walk into any room and own it with just a look. She'd gone on to work as a buyer for a high-end boutique, always knowing the latest trends before they even hit Boston, her taste flawless and her confidence unshakable. The three of us had been inseparable since high school, through heartbreaks and wild adventures, through babies and bills, and even when life tried to pull us in different directions, we found our way back to each other. They'd told me for years that Gary was no good, that he was grinding me down to nothing, and though they begged me to leave, I always clung to some fragile hope that he would remember how he used to love me. Half an hour after that phone call, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there they were like an army ready for battle. Nicole lugged in her massive rolling case, packed with brushes, palettes, sprays, and powders, like a general carrying her weapons. Right behind her was Brooke, her arms loaded with garment bags that looked like they belonged backstage at a runway show. They didn't waste a second sizing up the wreck I must have looked like, red-eyed, blotchy, hunched in my old hoodie, before Brooke pointed at me with that sharp smile and said, "All right, soldier, wipe those tears. Operation Cinderella starts now." She swept into the living room with the energy of a woman who had no doubts about the outcome, declaring that not only would I be going to that wedding, but every man there would trip over himself trying to get a glimpse of me, and Gary could stew in the corner choking on his regret. Nicole wrapped her arms around me, warm and steady. whispering that I wasn't some invisible mouse, that I was a queen who had just forgotten her crown, and that they were here to remind me. Her words wrapped around me like a blanket, and for the first time that day, I felt the faint stir of excitement under all that fear. Brooke unzipped one of the garment bags and revealed a dress that shimmered like midnight, deep navy silk scattered with tiny crystals that caught the light like a sky full of stars. She slid out another, a bold emerald gown with an asymmetrical cut, and a slit daring enough to make my heart skip, yet elegant enough to feel powerful instead of cheap. There was a third, pale blush pink, soft and airy like a cloud at dawn, and I had to grip the back of the chair just to steady myself because I had never in my life been this close to anything so breathtaking. My chest tightened with disbelief that any of this could be for me. But Brooke's eyes sparkled with certainty, and Nicole was already lining up her brushes like a painter about to bring a portrait back to life. The third dress Brooke revealed was a soft blush pink, light and airy like it had been spun out of clouds, and my breath caught in my throat because I had never even touched clothes like this, much less imagined slipping one over my own shoulders. "These are designer pieces," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I brushed the fabric, still half afraid it might vanish if I blinked. Brooke gave me that sly grin of hers and shot back. "What did you think, Megan? We were going to send you off in sweatpants?" The way she said it made me laugh through the tears, and for the first time in weeks, the heaviness inside me lifted. Before I could second-guess myself, they were both in motion. Nicole had already set up shop on my coffee table, lining up her brushes, palettes, and little jars like she was a surgeon preparing for an operation, her voice steady and matter-of-fact as she explained each step. "First we prep the skin. Mask, moisturizer, primer. Let's bring that glow back out," she murmured, her hands moving gently but with such certainty. She talked about smoky eyes, not harsh or heavy, but soft and smoldering to draw out the green in mine, and when she picked up a lipstick in a deep berry shade, she smiled and said, "This one's you." Strong but warm. I sat there like a doll in their hands, letting them layer me back together piece by piece, and it felt less like makeup and more like someone was reminding my face how to shine again. While Nicole worked on me, Brooke was a whirlwind in the background, pulling out shoes and handbags to pair with the emerald dress she'd decided was the winner, the gown bold but elegant, cut in a way that made me feel like I could breathe again. She held up a pair of heels so delicate I thought I might break them just by looking, and a clutch that shimmered under the lamplight like it was made of secrets. I kept shaking my head, murmuring that this was too much, that I wasn't someone who wore things like this, and each time Brooke just rolled her eyes, saying, "You're exactly the woman for this, you just forgot it. We're here to remind you." When they finally stepped back and told me to look, they led me into the bedroom and turned me toward the full-length mirror, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Staring back wasn't the tired woman with dark circles and sagging shoulders I had grown used to, but someone I thought I'd buried years ago, someone softer and freer. Only now she was more refined, more sure of herself, radiant in a way that startled me. My hands rose to my face as tears stung my eyes, because for the first time in what felt like forever, I recognized myself. Not the ghost Gary had convinced me I was, but the girl I used to be, reborn as a woman who knew her worth. When I finally dared to lift my eyes to the mirror, I froze because the woman staring back at me was nothing like the faded shadow I had grown used to. My green eyes, deepened with soft, smoky tones, looked almost endless. My skin glowed as if it had been lit from within, and the emerald silk clung to my frame like it had been made just for me, hugging my waist, flowing over my hips with quiet power. For a moment, I forgot to breathe because I had never seen myself like this. Not dressed up for someone else, not trying to please Gary, but standing tall in my own beauty. Nicole tilted her head with a grin, murmuring, "Still think you're just a little mouse?" And I reached down, letting my fingers slide across the cool fabric, the sensation almost surreal, like silk and possibility had been stitched together. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a worn-out housewife with stains on her sleeves. I felt like a woman again, desired, luminous, alive. My shoulders straightened without me even realizing, and when I met my friend's eyes, I saw them shining back at me with pride. Words stumbled out of me. "Thank you, girls. I don't even know what to say." But Brooke cut me off with a wave, laughing as she told me not to say a thing, only to walk in there and let Gary choke on the sight of what he had nearly destroyed. She pressed my hands and whispered fiercely that I needed to lock this feeling inside me, that I could never again let anyone convince me I was less than I am. That promise clung to me as they called a black car service, the kind I'd only ever watched other people take, and when I stepped into the hallway to grab my purse, the air felt charged, like electricity crackling in my chest. Every step down the staircase felt both unreal and terrifying, my heels clicking against the wood like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name, my heart hammering in anticipation of what was waiting for me beyond our street. As I reached the bottom, Ethan poked his head out of the playroom, his Lego set abandoned behind him, and his eyes widened like he was seeing a character leap straight out of the TV. "Mom," he whispered, almost reverent, you look like a princess." My throat caught, and I crouched just enough to smile at him through the haze of tears that suddenly welled. "Thank you, sweetheart. Tonight your mom just has to go to a ball." I kissed the top of his head, straightened my back, and slid into the waiting car, my pulse racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration, because I wasn't just heading to a wedding, I was heading straight into a moment that would change everything. The ride out to Willow Creek Country Club felt longer than it probably was, every mile carrying me further from the woman I had been, and closer to someone I wasn't sure I'd recognize. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore, it was about walking into a new version of myself, one that had been buried under years of exhaustion and doubt. As we pulled up, the place shimmered like something out of a movie, strings of lights wrapped around tall oaks, music drifting out from the ballroom, the lot crammed with luxury cars gleaming under the lamps. I asked the driver to let me out a little down the road, just like Gary had ordered, but as I stepped onto the pavement in my gown and heels, I felt less like someone sneaking in and more like someone stepping into destiny. I stood there for a second, gathering my breath, palms slick with nerves, my heart racing so hard it rattled in my chest. The words Brooke had said earlier rang through me like a drumbeat. "Walk in there and own it." I repeated them to myself as I paid the driver, my fingers trembling, then smoothed the fabric of the emerald dress and started down the stone walkway toward the entrance. Each click of my heels on the cobblestones was steady and deliberate, silk sliding over my legs, the cool night air brushing against my skin like a secret blessing. Even the security guards near the door paused to look at me, and a few drivers leaned out of their cars for another glance, and instead of shame, I felt their eyes giving me strength. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The lobby stretched high with marble columns and gilded trim, chandeliers raining soft light over polished floors, and from deep inside the hall I could hear laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. My stomach twisted with nerves, but there was no turning back. The celebration was in full swing, exactly as Gary had planned, the perfect cover for me to slip in unnoticed. Only, it didn't work that way. Because the second I pushed open the doors to the ballroom, the energy of the place seemed to change, like a wave rushing to shore. The music kept playing, the lights sparkled, but the voices began to quiet, one by one, as heads turned. I felt it before I even registered their faces. The stillness spreading, conversations dying mid-sentence, glasses frozen halfway to lips. I had walked in intending to vanish, to fold myself into the corner the way Gary demanded. But instead, every eye in that glittering room was suddenly on me, and for the first time in years, I didn't shrink. I lifted my chin and let them look. The ballroom was vast, ceilings soaring high above me, crystal chandeliers scattering light in 1,000 directions, tall windows reflecting back the glitter of the night. The place buzzed with energy, clusters of guests laughing and sipping champagne, servers gliding between them with trays of hors d'oeuvres, the sound of clinking glasses mixing with music that felt alive in my chest. And then, as I stepped inside, heels striking the polished floor, it was as though the room itself inhaled, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, until I felt it ripple through the air. It started with one pair of eyes catching me, then another, and then a cascade, the laughter thinning, the chatter faltering, until a strange hush swept across the space. People turned, curious at first, and then their expressions shifted into something else: surprise, admiration, even a kind of disbelief. I could see men pause mid-gesture, champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips, staring as though they had just seen someone step out of a dream. The women were no less attentive, their gazes sharper, scanning the cut of my dress, the sweep of my hair, the shimmer of my makeup. Some looked approving, others narrowed their eyes with the kind of envy that stung even from a distance, but every one of them looked. For a heartbeat, I was no longer invisible, no longer the mouse Gary had reduced me to. I was luminous, undeniable, a woman who demanded notice simply by being. Nicole and Brooke's work had been flawless. Nothing overdone, nothing screaming for attention, just a quiet, commanding elegance that drew it all the same. Across the room, I spotted Gary, standing in a circle with his colleagues, his voice loud, his hands moving animatedly as he tried to charm them, and I almost laughed because I could see the exact moment he sensed it. The shift, the silence, the weight of all those eyes, and turned to find its source. Our gazes locked, his smile faltering in slow motion, the corners of his mouth drooping until his lips parted in shock. His face drained and then flushed, and in that suspended moment between us, I felt something I hadn't in years: power. When my eyes locked with Gary's across the room, the expression on his face was something I'll never forget. It was pure shock, like he had been punched in the chest and couldn't catch his breath, his mouth falling open as he realized the woman standing at the center of all that attention was the same one he had ordered to sneak in unnoticed, the wife he'd branded a burden and a mouse. For a moment I thought he might actually deny it to himself, pretend I wasn't me, but the recognition hit him hard, and there was no hiding from it. Around us, the ripple spread through whispers that rose and fell like a tide. I caught fragments. "That's Megan, Gary's wife?" "No way." Another voice closer. "She's stunning. How did he keep her hidden?" And then a laugh behind me. "A mouse?" "She's the gem of the night." Each murmur sliced through the air and landed on Gary like stones, and I watched the red climb up his neck until his face matched the shade of the wine in his glass. He had wanted me invisible, and instead he was the one exposed, stripped bare by the stares and astonishment of everyone who saw what he had tried to bury. Inside, my stomach fluttered, nerves dancing against the edges of my composure, but on the outside I walked slowly, deliberately, weaving deeper into the room as if none of it fazed me. My hands were steady at my sides, though my heart beat so fast I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't looking for him, not tonight. I scanned for an empty chair, somewhere at the edge like he had demanded, trying to follow through on his orders, if only to hold on to the small sense of defiance that had gotten me here. But it seemed the night had other plans. Because before I could retreat to a shadowed corner, I heard a warm male voice beside me, smooth and resonant, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Excuse me, I don't believe we've met." I turned, and there he was, tall, confident, a presence that filled the space without effort, his dark hair brushed with a touch of gray at the temples, his eyes sharp yet kind, full of genuine interest. In his hands he held 2 flutes of champagne, and with an easy grace he offered one to me, his gaze lingering as though I were the only person in that glittering room. He extended one of the glasses toward me with a steady hand, his smile warm but not overdone, and said, "Charles Anderson, best man tonight, and a lifelong friend of Thomas." I took the flute, my fingers brushing against his just for a second, and the contact sent a warmth through me that startled me with its intensity. "Megan," I managed, barely more than a breath, and the way he repeated my name, slowly, tasting each syllable like it meant something, made me blush harder than I had in years. "Megan," he said again, softer this time, his eyes holding mine. "A beautiful name for a truly beautiful woman. Forgive my bluntness, but I haven't been able to look away since you walked in. You lit up this whole room." My cheeks burned at his words, heat rushing up to my face so fast I almost had to turn away. Compliments had long become foreign territory to me. Gary's words were always barbs, never praise, and I realized with a pang that I had forgotten how to even respond to admiration that was genuine. Charles tilted his head, amused at my awkwardness, and said gently, "You're flustered, which only makes you more enchanting. Are you here alone?" The question hung between us, and I glanced toward the corner of the room where Gary stood stiff, his skin flushed crimson, his glare drilling into me from across the crowd. "My husband is here," I said, the words awkward on my tongue, and Charles followed my gaze, his eyes landing on Gary for just a moment before he looked back at me with a curious half-smile. "Strange," he murmured. "If I had a wife like you, I wouldn't leave her side for a second. He's braver than I'll ever be, letting you stand here by yourself." And just like that, the tension began to ease. He didn't leave me for the rest of the evening, and to my own surprise, I didn't want him to. He was more than charm and good looks. He was full of stories, rich with curiosity about the world, speaking about art and travel with such fire in his voice that I found myself hanging on every word. I laughed with him in a way I hadn't laughed in years, my shoulders loosening, my mind uncoiling, and I felt a piece of myself coming back to life as we talked. While out of the corner of my eye, I could still see Gary burning with jealousy, powerless to stop what had already begun. Charles was everything Gary had never been, gracious in small ways that mattered, pulling out my chair before I sat, making sure my glass was never empty, bringing over little plates of hors d'oeuvres without being asked, and weaving compliments into conversation so naturally they felt like observations rather than flattery. There was no sleaze in his tone, no agenda in his words, just a steady warmth that made my chest ache with the realization of how starved I'd been for simple kindness. He looked at me with an attention so genuine that for the first time in years I felt like more than someone's background noise. As the evening went on, I found myself opening up to him in a way that startled me. I told him about Ethan and Hannah, about the sketches hidden in the back of my closet that I hadn't touched in years, about the French films I used to sneak out to see in college before life became diapers and carpool lines. And he didn't just nod or smile distractedly. He listened. Really listened. He leaned in, asked questions, wanted to know what I thought about the world, about art, about stories that weren't even his own. With each word, I felt my shoulders lifting, my voice growing steadier, as if I were remembering who I used to be, and realizing she was still there, waiting. I laughed that night, not the polite laugh I gave Gary's colleagues at corporate dinners, not the brittle sound I used when I wanted to diffuse his temper, but a deep, unguarded laugh that shook loose some part of me I had locked away. I made little jokes, teased back, let myself shine in a way I hadn't dared in years, and with every glance from Charles, with every soft smile, I felt alive again, fascinating, even beautiful. It was intoxicating, not because of the champagne, but because someone finally saw me and wanted to hear me. From across the room, Gary watched it all, and though I tried not to look, I could feel the heat of his stare like a furnace against my back. His colleagues clapped him on the shoulder, chuckling, saying things like, "You sly devil, hiding a wife like that." And he forced a tight, bitter smile, the kind that cracked at the edges. I knew what he saw. The woman he'd spent years crushing into silence now blooming right in front of him, her laughter spilling out beside another man. And it must have burned twice as deep, because that man wasn't just anyone. It was Charles Anderson, one of the most respected businessmen in Boston, the kind of connection Gary bragged about at every opportunity. Only now, Charles wasn't looking at him, he was looking at me. It was one thing for Gary to see Charles sitting beside me, offering champagne, and listening to me as though every word mattered. But when the music slowed and the first notes of a tender melody drifted through the ballroom, everything shifted again. Charles leaned toward me, his voice low, warm, steady, asking if he could have this dance, and for a heartbeat I hesitated. My eyes flicked across the room to Gary, who stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his face tight and dark with fury, every muscle in his jaw locked. That sight alone would have been enough to paralyze me once, but then I turned back to Charles and found his gaze, kind, patient, full of quiet encouragement. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep shrinking for the sake of Gary's pride. I placed my hand in Charles's and whispered, "I'd love to." He led me to the center of the floor with a confidence that didn't need to boast, his hand steady at my waist, guiding me into the rhythm with a tenderness I had never known. The strength of his hold was grounding, protective, and yet he carried it with such grace that I felt lighter than I had in years. My palm rested on his shoulder, my fingers grazing the fabric of his suit, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne, subtle, expensive, something earthy and refined, and the closeness of it all made my chest swell. Each step flowed into the next, not forced, not rehearsed, but natural, like we had always been meant to move together in this way. The room around us blurred into a haze, the polished floor, the glitter of the chandeliers, the hundreds of eyes watching, none of it mattered. For the length of that song, there was only the music and the warmth of his hand, only the slow turning of the world as I let myself be carried. I closed my eyes, not to shut anyone out, but to let it sink in, to feel how it was to be held, not with contempt or indifference, but with care. Years of Gary's insults and coldness melted away, replaced by the dizzying freedom of being seen, cherished, even desired. When the last note faded and we stilled, the silence lasted just a beat before the hall erupted in applause. I opened my eyes to see not judgment, but admiration in the faces around us, and I realized the entire room had been watching. Even Thomas and his radiant bride made their way over, laughter spilling between them, Thomas clapping Charles on the back with a grin. "Charles, you always do manage to find the most beautiful woman in the room," he teased, before turning to me with a smile that felt sincere. "Megan, you look absolutely breathtaking tonight." My cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from pride, a quiet pride that had been buried far too long. Thomas's words were still ringing in my ears. "Gary, you should be proud of your wife." When Gary finally stalked over, his face pulled into something that was supposed to resemble a smile, but couldn't hide the storm underneath. He muttered something stiff, forced, about being proud, but the second the laughter shifted elsewhere, his hand clamped down hard on my arm just above the elbow, his breath hot against my ear as he hissed, "We'll talk at home." The pressure of his fingers was sharp, bruising, and in that instant, the sparkle of the evening vanished, leaving only dread. The drive back to Boston was suffocating. Gary gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might snap, his jaw clenched, muscles twitching in the harsh glow of the dashboard lights. I sat silent in the passenger seat, staring at the blur of headlights and neon bleeding across the windows, trying to hold on to the memory of laughter and music, but feeling it drain from me like water slipping through my hands. I knew this silence too well. It wasn't peace. It wasn't calm. It was the gathering stillness before a storm. As soon as we crossed the threshold of our apartment, the door slamming behind us, the storm broke. He yanked off his tie like it was strangling him, his face contorting with rage, spit flying as he snarled, "Well? Are you satisfied now? You humiliated me tonight." His words hit me harder than his grip had, each accusation more twisted than the last. When I asked softly, almost to myself, how I could have possibly humiliated him just by standing tall for once, his fury only grew. He accused me of flaunting myself, of draping myself over Charles in plain sight, his voice rising until it bounced off the walls like gunfire. Step by step he advanced, his body looming, his finger jabbing, calling me cheap, shameless, a pretender who fancied herself a queen, and with every step I found myself backing away until my shoulders met the cold wall. My chest heaved, my palms pressed flat against the plaster as though it could open and swallow me whole. I had known this was coming, the moment of reckoning for daring to shine, for letting someone see me. but knowing didn't make it easier. I could smell the bitterness of his sweat, feel the heat of his anger closing in, and in that moment, the memory of Charles's steady gaze felt like the only thing holding me upright. The torrent of accusations came at me like a flood of sewage, every word dripping with contempt. No pause, no breath, no hint of remorse or tenderness. There wasn't a single acknowledgement of the night we'd shared, no recognition of the effort I had made, only venom and jealousy spilling out of him. He couldn't forgive me for being seen, for stepping out of the role he had forced me into, for proving, even for one evening, that I could shine without him. It wasn't about me at all. It was about the wound to his ego, the bruise to his pride, the humiliation of watching a woman he had diminished for years draw admiration from a man he envied. I tried, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were wasted. "I just danced, Gary," I whispered, still clinging to reason, still hoping he might hear me. I wasn't throwing myself at him. He was simply polite. The way his laugh exploded, cruel and sharp, made me flinch as though he had struck me. He leaned in close, spitting his mockery in my face, twisting my attempt at honesty into another weapon. "Polite? He undressed you with his eyes, Megan, and you lapped it up, all dolled up, painted like some cheap ornament, thinking a dress makes you someone else." He jabbed his finger toward me, his voice rising with each word. "You think putting on silk and heels changes what you are? You're still the same useless housewife, the mouse you've always been, just in fancy wrapping. Don't forget where you belong, in this kitchen, behind that stove, not out embarrassing me in front of men who matter." His words cut sharper than any blade, carving into all the insecurities I had carried for years. But instead of shrinking the way I always had, something inside me finally snapped. It was as though a wire pulled too tight had given way with a violent crack. For hours I had felt the glow of being seen, of being admired not just for how I looked, but for who I was, and I realized in that instant that I couldn't unfeel it, couldn't shove it back into the box Gary had built for me. His insults no longer defined me. They only revealed how small he was, how afraid. My hands stopped trembling, my breath steadied, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a man to fear. I saw a bitter, insecure bully who had lost the one thing he never imagined could slip away: my submission. For so long I had let him trample me, burying every spark of who I used to be under his insults and demands. But that night, something inside me held fast. He wanted to crush the fragile shoots of confidence I had just begun to grow, to drag me back into the mud of shame and smallness, but I realized with startling clarity that he couldn't. Not anymore. When I lifted my eyes to his, there was no fear left, no tears welling, just a cold, steady contempt that surprised even me. "Yes, Gary, I am a housewife," I said, my voice firm in a way I hardly recognized as my own. "I'm the one who made this home for you, who raised your children, washed and ironed your shirts so you could walk out the door looking important while I forgot who I was. I gave up pieces of myself so you could build your career without ever worrying what waited for you at home. And you can't even celebrate me for one night. All you know how to do is tear me down because you're weak, insecure, and terrified." His mouth opened, but nothing came out, and for the first time I saw him not as the man who held power over me, but as a small, frightened boy lashing out. I pressed on, my voice icy, unwavering. "You're afraid of me being seen, because when people look at me and see more than a shadow, they'll see what you really are, petty, bitter, and insignificant. You're not protecting me from humiliation, Gary. You're protecting yourself from exposure." The words tasted sharp on my tongue, like steel, but I knew they were true. He just stood there, frozen, his face slack with shock. He wasn't used to this tone, this certainty. He was used to my silence, my tears, my retreat, not the clean, cutting truth spoken without rage, only finality. "What did you say?" he croaked, as if he needed me to repeat it just to believe it. I stepped away from the wall, brushed past him with a calm I had never felt before, and said simply, "You heard me. I won't let you treat me like this ever again." Then I walked toward the bedroom, not with the heaviness of defeat, but with the quiet knowledge that something irreversible had just shifted. Never again! The words echoed in my chest as I closed the bedroom door behind me, pressing my back against it while my lungs struggled to find air. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might break free, but underneath the fear was something else, a lightness, a rush of relief so sharp it almost hurt. I had done it. For the first time in all those years, I had stood up to him. The walls I had built around myself, the ones that kept me silent and small, had finally cracked and tumbled down. The next morning, rummaging through the clutch Brooke had lent me, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small card tucked into the lining. My stomach fluttered as I pulled it out, recognizing instantly what it was. Charles Anderson's business card, his name embossed in silver above a phone number. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers tracing the letters. Part of me recoiled. I was still married, wasn't I? A good wife wouldn't hold on to something like this. But then my mind replayed Gary's words from the night before, the venom, the accusations, the rage, and a different question rose inside me. What was truly wrong here? The card in my hand, or the marriage that had been dead for years? With my pulse racing, I typed a message with trembling thumbs. "Charles, it's Megan. Thank you for last night." I hovered over the screen, ready to delete it, but before I could, the reply buzzed through. "Megan, I'm so glad you reached out. I haven't stopped thinking about you. May I call?" My knees went weak, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the words. No one had said anything like that to me in so long. No one had looked at me as if I mattered, and the truth was, I wanted to hear his voice again. What began as short, careful messages soon stretched into long conversations that carried me into the night. His voice was steady, patient, never rushing me, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He asked about my days, my children, the things I loved that I thought no one cared about. He remembered details, circled back to them, made me feel seen in a way Gary never had. He was exactly as he'd seemed at the wedding, intelligent, attentive, with a quiet strength that put me at ease. And with every call, every shared laugh and thoughtful pause, I felt myself stepping further out of the shadows I had lived in for so long. When I walked into that cafe and saw Charles waiting with a bouquet of peonies, my favorite, though I hadn't told him, my breath caught in my throat. He rose from the table, smiling at me as though I were the only woman in the world, and when I sat across from him, the warmth of his gaze made the clatter of cups and chatter around us fade into nothing. Over coffee, something inside me settled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt entirely at peace, even joyful, the kind of happiness that isn't loud or fleeting but steady, like the quiet strength of a tide. That night, the clarity hit me with such force it left no room for doubt. I couldn't keep living in the half-life Gary had built for me, couldn't keep pretending that my marriage was anything but a cage. By the time his key turned in the lock, I was sitting in the living room waiting, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding, but my mind as clear as glass. When he came in, still shrugging out of his coat, I looked straight at him and said, "Gary, I'm filing for divorce." The words tasted final, heavy, but they were steady on my tongue. At first he blinked, like he hadn't heard me right. Then he let out this jagged laugh that curdled my blood. "Divorce? You? Who's gonna want you, Megan? You've got 2 kids, you're nothing without me. That boyfriend of yours, he'll use you up and toss you aside, and when he does, you'll crawl back here begging." His voice was full of smug certainty, but for once it didn't pierce me. I met his eyes and said, calm and sure, "Even if that happens, I'd rather be alone than live another day like this. I won't do it anymore." And for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. I packed quietly, just the essentials, clothes for the kids, a few things of mine, and dialed Nicole. Within 20 minutes, she and Brooke were there, standing on either side of me like sentinels. Brooke carried bags down the stairs, while Nicole planted herself in front of Gary, her chin raised, her voice sharp as glass. "You're pathetic, Gary. You tried to break her, but she's stronger than you ever were." He didn't have a retort, just that same hollow rage simmering in his eyes. As I stepped out into the night with my children and my friends, I felt the weight of chains I'd carried for years begin to fall away, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I was never going back. I stood for a moment in the doorway, my hand still on the knob, letting my eyes sweep over the apartment where I had spent 15 years of my life. But instead of grief, there was only clarity. Those walls hadn't been a home, they'd been a cage. "You just lost the best woman you'll ever have," I had told Gary, my voice calm, almost foreign even to me. "And you'll regret it. You'll regret it more than you know." With Ethan's small hand in one of mine and Hannah's in the other, I stepped out into the night, not with sorrow, but with a strange, steady relief, ready to walk toward a life that was unknown, but finally my own. The first days were a blur of exhaustion and small victories. Nicole opened her door without hesitation, giving us the biggest room in her apartment, no questions asked, no pity in her eyes, just love. The kids, shaken by the sudden change, seemed to sense the difference almost immediately. They whispered less, they played more, they slept through the night without waking to shouts. For the first time in years, our evenings were quiet. No slamming doors, no sharp words, just warmth, board games spread out on the table, Brooke laughing too loud over burnt popcorn, and my children watching it all with wide eyes, as if they couldn't quite believe peace could be this simple. Charles knew I had left, but he didn't push. He never once suggested I move in or tried to fill the empty space Gary had left. Instead, he stood just far enough away, steady and patient, helping when I let him, stepping back when I needed room. He found me a divorce lawyer who knew exactly how to handle men like Gary, men who thought intimidation could bend the law. And together, they built a case that protected not only me, but also Ethan and Hannah. For the first time in my life, I sat across from a lawyer's desk and felt like someone was fighting for me. Gary, of course, raged. He blustered, threatened, tried to shake me down with words he thought could scare me back into line. But every time he slammed his fists on the table, the lawyer barely blinked, calmly sliding papers across for him to sign, stripping away his power piece by piece. And Charles, he showed up not as a savior, but as a man who respected the gravity of what I was going through. When he finally met Ethan and Hannah, he did it gently, asking questions about their favorite books, their favorite games, letting them set the pace. And watching my children lean toward him, shy at first, then warming, I realized that what he offered wasn't just romance or escape. It was stability, respect, and a chance at a future none of us had dared to imagine. What struck me most about Charles was that he never tried to win Ethan and Hannah with things. He didn't show up with expensive toys or promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he gave them what they had been starved of for so long, time and attention. He took Ethan to soccer games and cheered louder than anyone, ran through the park with Hannah until they were both breathless, and spent entire afternoons on the floor helping her glue pieces of cardboard and paint to create the dollhouse of her dreams. He spoke to them with respect, as if their opinions mattered, never talking down, always listening, and little by little, I saw the way my children began to lean toward him, trusting him, opening up to him in a way they never had with their father. It wasn't only them who changed. It was me too. For years I had moved through life armored by silence, weighed down by fear and fatigue, but with Charles's steady presence and my newfound freedom, I felt the weight slide off my shoulders. I breathed deeper, laughed more freely, and looked in the mirror without flinching. Following his encouragement, I finally signed up for a graphic design course at the community college, something I had dreamed of but never dared to pursue. My old love for drawing and color, buried under years of laundry and late-night cooking, came rushing back, and I threw myself into it with a hunger I hadn't felt in decades. Those classes became more than just lessons. They were a lifeline. Every project I finished was a reminder that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was creating, thriving, becoming someone new. My instructors praised my work, telling me I had a natural eye, and I felt alive in a way I never thought possible. I wasn't simply a woman who had escaped a bad marriage. I was rebuilding, brick by brick, a life that felt truly mine. And through it all, Charles was there, never crowding me, never demanding, only supporting, reminding me that I deserved every bit of joy I was finally letting in. One evening, months later, we were having dinner at a little countryside restaurant, the kids giggling over dessert while candles flickered between us. The moment felt easy, unforced, and as the music drifted softly in the background, Charles pushed back his chair, dropped to one knee, and pulled a small box from his pocket. My breath caught as he looked up at me, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Megan, I loved you from the moment I saw you, and I love your children as if they were my own." The world seemed to hold still, and in that instant, I knew that all the pain, all the years of silence had led me here, to a love that was real, to a family that finally felt whole. When Charles knelt in front of me that night and said he wanted us to be a real family, the tears came before I could stop them. Ethan and Hannah practically shouted their joy, clapping their hands as if they'd been waiting all along for this moment, and I could only whisper, "Yes," through the lump in my throat. We moved into a beautiful house just outside the city, with a wide garden and tall windows that flooded every room with light. Each child had their own space, decorated just the way they wanted, and for me, there was a studio, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows where I could finally breathe, create, and let the artist inside me come alive again. Charles proved every day that he wasn't just my husband, but the father Ethan and Hannah had longed for. He sat with Ethan over his homework, teaching him patience, even showing him how to knot a tie before his first school dance. With Hannah, he curled up at night to read stories, giving each character a different voice until she giggled herself to sleep. He carried us all with a love so deep and steady that I sometimes had to pinch myself to believe it was real. And as I finished my design courses and stepped into a position at a major ad agency, my work and my confidence bloomed side by side, until one morning I looked in the mirror and saw not a shadow, but a woman, radiant and strong. Meanwhile, Gary's life unraveled. At first, he strutted through the office pretending he had been the one to cast me aside, but the mask slipped quickly. His shirts, once perfectly pressed, were now creased and sloppy. His dinners came from frozen boxes stacked in his fridge. Dust gathered in corners of the apartment he never noticed until it overwhelmed him. He discovered the emptiness of living without the invisible labor that had kept his world afloat. The same colleagues who once admired him began to whisper behind his back, their pity sharper than mockery. He learned too late that the woman he had dismissed as a mouse had been the very foundation of his comfort. And when word spread that I hadn't just left but found a life with Charles Anderson, one of the most respected men in Boston, Gary's humiliation was complete. The same people who once nodded politely at his stories now raised their glasses to me and Charles at dinners and events, speaking of us with admiration, not scandal. I didn't seek revenge, but it found him anyway, in the silence of his empty apartment and the sting of his lost reputation. As for me, I finally knew what it was to live without fear, to love without compromise, and to show my children that dignity and happiness were worth fighting for. That was the true ending to my story. Not the night Gary tried to break me, but the moment I walked away and never looked back. Word spread quickly, and before long Gary couldn't escape the weight of his own choices. At work, the sidelong glances turned into whispers, and the whispers into open smirks. His boss, Thomas, the same man who had once trusted him with everything, finally called him into his office. I heard later what he said. "I'm disappointed in you, Gary. I thought you were a decent man, but you turned out to be a petty tyrant. You humiliated the woman who gave you her life. You didn't value what you had, and if you can't be trusted with your own family, I can't trust you with my business." That conversation marked the beginning of the end for him. From there, the unraveling was swift. The colleagues who had once raised their glasses to his jokes began excluding him from meetings, handing him scraps of projects no one else wanted. He strutted at first, pretending none of it touched him, but the truth was obvious. His career was crumbling. The pride he had wielded like a weapon slipped through his fingers, leaving only bitterness. He started drinking more, snapping at people, losing the sharpness that once made him effective. A year later, the company let him go. Consistent underperformance, they said. And with that final blow, the life he had built on appearances collapsed like a house of cards. The man who once lorded his success over me was now a hollow shadow, nursing grudges in a dingy apartment, cut off from the circles that used to make him feel important. His arrogance had curdled into self-pity, his charm into sneers. People stopped inviting him anywhere. Even the ones who used to envy him now spoke of him with pity or disgust. He was left with nothing but the echo of the life he'd squandered, railing at a world that had simply moved on without him. I saw him once, years later, purely by chance. I was coming out of a cafe with Charles and the kids, Ethan taller now, Hannah holding my hand, and we were laughing at some silly joke. For a moment I caught Gary watching us from across the street, his face slack, his eyes clouded. I don't know if he recognized me at first, because the woman standing there was nothing like the shadow he had tried to keep hidden. I was radiant, free, loved, and for the first time I didn't feel anger or fear when I looked at him. I only felt gratitude that I had walked away when I did, because the life he destroyed for himself gave me the chance to finally build mine. I slipped my arm through Charles's, the way it had become so natural to do, and looked up at him with a love I had never known before. It wasn't the desperate need to be noticed, or the quiet pleading for crumbs of affection I had lived on for years. It was steady, overflowing, certain. In that glance between us, I knew he was my partner, my safe place, my future. Across the street, I caught sight of Gary. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and in that instant, I saw the realization wash over him like a wave. He understood what he had lost, and worse, that it was gone forever. The truth hit him harder than any words I could have said. He had spent years calling me a mouse, diminishing me, trying to keep me small, and now he was seeing me as I really was, a woman who had risen from the ashes of his cruelty, walking freely beside a man who valued her. The bitterness in his eyes was mixed with something else, regret so deep it seemed to hollow him out. For the first time, I knew he would carry the weight of his mistakes for the rest of his life. He shifted, as if he wanted to cross the street, to speak, to beg, but there was nothing left to say. No apology could erase the years of humiliation. No promises could undo the choices he had made. So he stood rooted in place, watching silently as we turned the corner. He was left behind, alone with the ruins of his pride, his anger, and the emptiness he had built with his own hands. It was justice, harsh but undeniable. As for me, I had walked through humiliation, heartbreak, and loss, and I had come out the other side not broken, but whole. I had found love, dignity, and a future that was truly mine. That is the justice I want every woman to know is possible. You can reclaim yourself, you can rebuild, and you can thrive. If this story touched you, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe even your own experiences. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Your support means the world to me, and it helps us keep sharing these real, emotional journeys together.